Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with Tianwei, still to come on our program. The U.S. looks to India as a partner in a strategic relationship and as a counterbalance to China. Our panelists weigh in on U.S. policy in Asia right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tianwei, coming to you Monday to Friday live on CGTN. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said before a visit to India next week that the Trump administration was working to dramatically deepen ties with India, seeing New Delhi as a key partner in the face of growing Chinese influence in Asia. On Wednesday, less than a month before President Donald Trump is due to make his first state visit to China, Tillerson said the U.S. had begun to discuss alternatives to Chinese infrastructure financing in Asia. The U.S. strategy is expected to be part of the agenda of Mr. Trump's visit to Asia next month. So, should the U.S. pursue a strategic relationship with India affect China? Let's get down to business. With us in our Beijing studio, we have our panelist, Rong Ying, who is the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we invited Sourabh Gupta, a Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with ICAS, and also in D.C. we have Richard Rossow, who is the Chair in the U.S.-India Policy Studies of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, I want to welcome to the three of you. Mr. Rossow, maybe I should throw the first question to you. How should we understand this? Right before President Trump made a visit to China, Secretary Tillerson spoke in a way that he has never used the tone before, very abrupt and blunt in expressing U.S. approach to China vis-a-vis India. How should we understand this, Mr. Rossow?
Well, I think the language on China, you're going back to when President Trump was a candidate to run for office, has went back and forth in terms of kind of an aggressive posture versus China versus something that's more supportive. So you've seen the language change in tenor over the last year. But, you know, I think concerns about China's rise and potential aggressiveness is one of the areas that's really bound U.S. and India together on defense and security. So for Tillerson, I think both to retrace some of the early steps on raising concerns about China, you know, that's been part and parcel since early in the Trump administration, again, going back to when he was a candidate even, but also a good door opening, I think, for the Indian side. So a scene setter, I think, for both to wake Beijing up that there's increased concerns about North Korea, but make sure that New Delhi's got its door wide open when Tillerson arrives. I see. Following Secretary Tillerson's speech about that, the Chinese embassy in Washington said this in a statement, that China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion, never pursue development at the expenses of others' interests. It added that China contributes to and also defends the rules-based world order. End of the quote. I want to come to you, Mr. Rong, here in Beijing. To you, what does that quote say? And how is China seeing this apparently Washington's ever closer approach to India, try to make a quote-unquote balance between India and China when it comes to their strategy?
I think on the question of the relationship between U.S. and India, if it serves the interest of the stability and the peace in the region, China would not have any questions. But as the speaker said, and also I think at the speech, I think tells loudly that it seems that the U.S. has been very much want to put kind of a policy framework where they would like to balance India vis-a-vis China. And this is, I think, what struck me most was that the way that putting it in a public, in a specific naming and criticizing China's role. And that is why I think the foreign ministry, the foreign spokesperson said China hoped that U.S. would take a positive views
I
about
see.
China's rise. So I thought that it is a very certainly, I think, not a diplomatic for me way of talking about China vis-a-vis India. So putting the China and India in the same equation.
Whatever the wording is, Mr. Gupta, how should we understand this? Seem to be the very beginning of a relatively grand strategy coming from Washington. At least they want us to have that kind of feeling, that they're going to try to make some balance between India and China in order to have a so-called comfortable space for the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Gupta, is that going to be good for India, though, as this so-called balancing board?
India has welcomed U.S. support and U.S. relations and the U.S. presence in Asia, and particularly more so in the Indian Ocean region. But India's primary goal with regard to the United States is to use U.S. power as a means to advance its own strategic rise and its own independent rise in the international system. This does not mean that it intends to just use the United States. It does seek a friendly relationship with the United States, but it should not be assumed or taken for granted that a friendly relationship with the United States would automatically translate into an adversarial relationship with China. The United States would like that to generally go on India's relationship to China to generally drift in that direction, a more adversarial one. But that is not necessarily in the way the Indian strategic establishment has always viewed it. And they have actually viewed both China and the United States as being very significant powers, and that India must have good or decent relationships with both powers so it can expand its own strategic space and its options as it hopes to rise in the world affairs.
Mr. Rong, those words are interesting coming from Mr. Gupta. China-India used to have some kinds of disputes earlier regarding territory. Of course, it's not China-India's territory dispute, but rather involving a third party. But it seems that both parties have settled that through certain kinds of talks and steps. Does that help us to understand the mentality of both sides as to what kind of relationship they're trying to establish or maintain?
Well, China and India have been working very hard to develop a stable relationship oriented towards a kind of common development. And that has been, I think, served the best interest of the two sides. And it also, I think, has proved that it helps the two sides to accomplish their mission. That is, say, for China is a national reunification, and for India they also want to play to exert a role. That is, say, a great power that it has been to be reckoned with, and that is, I think, the strategy for the two sides. And it is unfortunate, I think, for U.S. to thinking in a way that it could by playing the differences, or the card that against India, with India against China is something I think would have served it. So I thought it is a bad strategy, and I'm happy that our India colleagues made it very clear it knows very well. And I would also argue that it is very clear that the U.S. By having India would serve its interest to maintain the primacy. And for that, India has to be very careful. It is not looking for a kind of a partner at equal status. Possibly it doesn't want to have a junior partner that helps U.S. to serve its interest in the region.
Mr. Rossow, the other two gentlemen said it's not a good idea.
Well, I disagree. I think I think India, we have a shared value system. I do think that India, it's a dance that we're playing right now. What is India's forward-leaning security role going to be for the region? And we don't really have an answer to that question per se. They're not involved in the fight against the Islamic State. You know, India wasn't comfortable making a statement against Russia with the invasion of Ukraine and Georgia. So you look at what, at least from Washington's perspective, we consider, you know, the main points of concern around the globe: South China Sea and the various disputes, many of which China's involved in, and India doesn't play a very forward-leaning role on that. Yet India at the same time desires U.S. military equipment. So, you know, the question that we continue to dance around is, you know, if we're going to equip India, you know, what are the missions that India thinks are in its interest, which happen to align with ours? And that's really where the state of relations between the U.S. and India lie. What are those areas? Well, I think India itself, they want to make sure that they maintain dominance in the Indian Ocean. And so I think the fact that the PLA Navy has been more active in the Indian Ocean has been a wake-up call for India that, you know, they may not be equipped to monitor and counter just in case things would escalate there. They're not ready in case something should be a flashpoint. And they're looking over at the South China Sea and they're seeing multiple flashpoints simultaneously. So it's not an abstract question, could there be a flashpoint, because they see a lot of their friends, also fellow democracies across Asia, that have seen these flashpoints arise recently. So it's far from an abstract. So I think in that sense, you know, India is generating some kind of a mission that I think is a little bit more forward-leaning than simply defending its own, you know, territorial integrity and concerns about border disputes with both Pakistan and China. It's expanded to the Indian Ocean. The U.S. and India are cooperating in some new areas, you know, for instance, in equipping African peacekeepers, which was referenced in Tillerson's speech. They're reaching out to new partners like Mongolia and Korea, which India had not looked to as really as security strategic partners before.
I see.
So I think Washington's starting to see some real tangible moves from Delhi we hadn't seen in the past, and that's really reaffirming this interest in engaging as much as we have.
Well, Mr. Gupta, Mr. Rossow was saying, why can't you see something that I already see? What do you say?
Well, let me phrase it this way. The U.S. had wanted India, and this goes back right to the George W. Bush administration, which really laid the opening for U.S.-India ties. They had sought India's strategic alignment to the United States. India instead had sought strategic autonomy and independent rise. Both sides saw that their interests were not totally aligned and in this regard. And so in the next phase of their relationship, I would say what they limited their ambitions in seeking more of a defense and technological partnership, wherein U.S. would supply a lot of high-tech weaponry to India, while India also got off a little bit, got off that position that we are just going to be strategically autonomous, and was ready to have a more functionally deepened relationship with the U.S. from a defense and perhaps strategic viewpoint, but it also limited the geographic scope of that interoperable relationship to just the Indian Ocean region. And that's why, yes, there's a little bit of cooperation happening on African peacekeeping. Yes, they talk of let's do some connectivity initiatives and infrastructure. And India, of course, has its own independent policies with many of the countries on China's periphery. But it's important to note, I mean, think in something like the South China Sea. India, and I understand this both from very senior people at the Indian end and from important people at the Chinese end, that the highest authorities in India have assured China that India will not be aligned with the position of the other countries on South China Sea issues, even as it has its own independent position. So you see that there's this gap, and that gap does exist.
All right, the gap does exist. And let me go to you, Mr. Rong, because South China Sea, you see that, the U.S. talking about rebalance, and you see countries have to line up, whether they're with the United States or they're with China, and they had a very difficult time as a result, and things have not resolved 100% even today. Now you see possibly another hotspot issue as a result of U.S. trying to approach India in a very different way, as we mentioned earlier. So, sir, what is your understanding of how this region should be and how China, U.S., even India can coexist and each have its own way of development and maintain its strategy of growing power?
That exactly, I mean, worries me most when I had the speech by Secretary Tillerson, and also by having, I mean, American colleagues about putting a kind of a strategy that having India to join the kind of agenda to isolate or contain China based on the so-called shared values or democracy. By the way, that has never been, I mean, the thing founded. If you look at the history of India-U.S. relationship, a so-called exchange democracy. I mean, so history tells a lot about this. But it's right. I think if you look at the region, I mean, Asia-Pacific, even including an Indian Ocean regions, I think what we have, the prosperity, the stability, and that have been enjoyed so far is largely because we have a stable and cooperative relationship among major powers. So if I think the strategy of the U.S. goes along the way that we are talking about, particularly, then I think I worried that the atmosphere, the relationship between major power will be undermined. And of course, the relationship that suffered most is the China-U.S. relationship, which has been all agreed that is the most important. They have to remain constructive and cooperative for the good of the relationship and also for the region.
Of course, this will be a topic for a long time, I would assume, gentlemen, with the upcoming visit by U.S. President Donald Trump to China and also the APEC summit later being held in Vietnam. But for now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us and sharing your insights. Rong Ying, Sourabh Gupta, and Richard Rossow. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. Have a great weekend. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next week for insights across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.